Donald Trump woke up to a political nightmare, one that didn't arrive with sirens or subpoenas, but with something far more dangerous: betrayal from inside his own walls. The morning began like so many others. The familiar glow of screens. Headlines scrolling. Advisors whispering just beyond earshot. But this Tuesday felt different. There was a tightness in the air, the kind you feel before a storm breaks. Phones buzzed more urgently. Assistants avoided eye contact. And somewhere between the first cup of coffee and the first briefing, Trump saw it. Vanity Fair. Not an op-ed. Not a rumor. A two-part investigative piece. 11 interviews. Months of reporting. And at the center of it all, Susie Wiles. The woman who had been his chief of staff. The woman who sat in rooms where decisions were made before they ever reached paper. The woman who knew his habits, his moods, his fears, and his secrets. And now, she was speaking. What followed was not a gentle critique or a polished distancing. It was a scorched-earth assessment, one that peeled back the curtain on Trump's inner circle and revealed something raw, chaotic, and deeply unsettling. Wiles described Trump as having what she called an alcoholic's personality. Not necessarily an addiction to alcohol, but the behaviors that often accompany it: impulsivity, denial, emotional volatility, a refusal to take responsibility, and an insatiable need for control. According to her, Trump didn't just thrive on chaos, he depended on it. It energized him, grounded him, made him feel alive. She painted a picture of a man who distrusted silence, who filled every gap with noise, conflict, or spectacle. A man who interpreted loyalty as obedience and disagreement as betrayal. Someone who demanded constant affirmation, yet rarely returned it. Then she turned her focus outward, to the people who orbited him. J.D. Vance, she said, wasn't a man who evolved. He was a man who calculated. For years, Wiles described him as a conspiracy theorist, someone who trafficked in suspicion and grievance. His dramatic pivot toward Trump, she claimed, wasn't ideological growth or reconciliation, it was ambition. A Senate run demanded proximity to power, and Trump was the sun. Elon Musk didn't escape scrutiny either. Wiles referred to him as an admitted ketamine user, an odd duck, whose erratic behavior often stunned those in the room. She described moments when his reactions felt irrational, disconnected, even reckless, leaving her wondering who was really steering conversations that carried enormous political and economic weight. Russell Vought, the architect behind Project 2025, was labeled bluntly, a right-wing zealot. Not a strategist seeking balance or consensus, but an ideologue driven by rigidity, convinced of his own moral clarity, unwilling to bend. And then there was Pam Bondi. According to Wiles, Bondi completely mishandled the Epstein files, one of the most sensitive and explosive matters in modern American politics. Opportunities to clarify, contain, or responsibly disclose were squandered. Mistakes were layered on top of mistakes. Silence replaced transparency. Confusion replaced accountability. But even that wasn't the worst of it. The most explosive claim came next, and it landed like a thunderclap. Wiles said Trump was all over the Epstein files. Not in vague whispers. Not through implication. But explicitly. According to her, Trump's name appears in the records. On the plane manifests. In the social orbit. She was careful to qualify her words. She described the period as one where both men were young, single playboys, downplaying criminality. But the confirmation itself was devastating. Presence matters. Association matters. Especially when the man in question has built years of political attacks around accusing others. And that's where Wiles drew a sharp line. Trump, she said, was wrong about Bill Clinton. Despite Trump's repeated claims, Wiles stated there is zero evidence Clinton ever visited Epstein's island. No manifests. No corroboration. No proof. The accusations, she suggested, were projection, or at the very least, reckless misdirection. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. Then came Trump's favorite fantasy, a third term. Publicly, he flirted with the idea. Teased it. Let it dangle like bait. Watched supporters cheer and critics panic. But Wiles revealed something else entirely. Privately, she said, Trump knows the Constitution blocks him. He's acknowledged it to her more than once. He understands the limits. He just enjoys the chaos. The confusion. The outrage. He likes watching people react. And then the article veered into territory even more disturbing. Foreign policy. Wiles recounted conversations about Venezuela that contradicted everything the administration had publicly claimed. According to her, Trump didn't just want to curb drug trafficking. He wanted to destabilize Nicolas Maduro's government outright. She quoted him as saying he wanted to keep blowing up boats until Maduro cried uncle. Not a metaphor. Not strategy jargon. A blunt expression of force. If true, it directly undermines the official narrative that the actions were narrowly focused on interdiction. It suggests regime change, not law enforcement, was the real goal. After the article was published, Wiles attempted to walk it back. She denied making many of the comments. Called the piece misleading. Suggested she'd been misrepresented. The author's response was short. There's tape. Her words were recorded. And suddenly, the denials rang hollow. Trump's allies called it a hit job. His defenders dismissed it as media bias. But beneath the spin, the substance remained. This wasn't a disgruntled outsider. This was someone from the inside, someone who had watched, listened, and eventually decided to speak. And as Trump's inner circle began to fracture, something else was happening quietly, relentlessly, across the country. The American people were paying the price. New data finally gave numbers to what millions of families had already been feeling in their bones. The United States had slipped into a hiring recession. Since April, job growth hadn't just slowed, it had nearly stalled. Paychecks weren't stretching any further, even as prices continued to rise. More than 710,000 additional Americans were out of work compared to November 2024, and behind every statistic was a face, a household, a plan put on hold. Manufacturing towns, once built on steady shifts and predictable pay, had now lost jobs 7 months in a row, their factories quieter, their parking lots emptier. The pain wasn't evenly shared. Young people were absorbing the heaviest blow. Youth unemployment climbed to a cycle high of 10.6%, slamming doors before careers could even begin. College graduates refreshed inboxes that stayed empty. Trade school apprentices watched opportunities disappear before their first day. For a generation told that hard work would be rewarded, the silence was deafening. Overall unemployment sat at 4.6%, inching toward 5%. Economists debated what that threshold meant on charts and forecasts. Families didn't need charts. They felt it at kitchen tables late at night, with bills spread out and calculators blinking red. Missed rent. Delayed weddings. Medical appointments postponed. Dreams quietly revised downward. Electric bills surged as massive data centers strained aging power grids, pushing costs onto households already stretched thin. Farmers, caught between climate volatility, rising fuel prices, and shrinking margins, watched bankruptcies climb and pleaded for relief. Even Republican senators, usually cautious with such admissions, conceded that existing aid wasn't enough. And yet, despite all of it, denial persisted. J.D. Vance stood on stages in Pennsylvania, touring communities where help-wanted signs had vanished and small businesses closed early to save on utilities. He looked out at voters whose lives told a very different story and insisted the pain wasn't real. When asked what grade he would give the economy, after Donald Trump had labeled it an A++, Vance didn't pause. A++, he said. Then came the line that lingered long after the microphones were turned off. Nobody ever said affordability would be fixed quickly. For millions of Americans forced to choose between groceries and gas, medicine and rent, that answer landed like a verdict. Not just because of what it said, but because of what it revealed. This was no longer just about policy. It was about perception. About leaders insulated from consequences, grading their own performance while others paid the price. About a widening gap between rhetoric and reality that people could feel every time they checked their bank balance. Somewhere between the loyalty demanded at the top and the quiet desperation below, a deeper question emerged. What happens to a country when truth becomes negotiable, accountability becomes optional, and power begins to justify itself? The Vanity Fair article didn't simply expose personalities. It exposed a system, one driven by ambition, sustained by chaos, and increasingly disconnected from the lived reality of the people it claims to represent. For some readers, the revelations were shocking. For others, they merely confirmed what they had long suspected. But for anyone truly paying attention, the story carried a sobering reminder. Democracy rarely collapses in a single, dramatic moment. It erodes slowly, through denial that becomes routine, silence that becomes survival, and dysfunction that becomes normalized. And yet, history also shows something else. Erosion can be resisted. Because in those same kitchens where panic lives, resilience does too. In communities rebuilding after layoffs, in young people refusing to give up, in families choosing honesty over comfort, there is still agency. The morning Trump woke up to that article, the nightmare wasn't just his. It was America's. But nightmares, unlike lies, don't last forever, especially when people decide to wake up.